By 1861, 2/3 of all Americans lived in the free states of the North. About 1/3 of the southern population were blacks who were held in the bondage of slavery. Since representation in the U.S. Congressional House of Representatives is based on population, by 1860 the House was dominated by the North. The economic importance of the South continued to grow as cotton became more important to the U.S. economy. Cotton exports grew from only 7% of all U.S. exports in 1800 to over 58% by 1861. Cotton became a key to American economic prosperity. Because of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, there were about as many slave states as there were free states in the Union. Even though the South had half the population of the North, they had equal representation in the Senate. Southern states used their representation in the Senate to influence national policies towards slavery. Sympathy against slavery started to develop and grow in the North. Abolitionists used whatever means they could to end slavery. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin depicted the evils of slavery to the American people. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin as a protest against the fugitive slave laws passed by Congress in 1850. These laws made Northerners responsible for enforcing slavery by mandating that they return runaway slaves. Lincoln jokingly referred to Stowe as the woman who started the Civil War. But many Northerners refused to compromise with the South anymore on slavery and drew a line in the sand. Abolitionists like John Brown actively worked against slavery. Brown and his followers moved to Kansas in the mid-1850s to try to keep slavery out by force. Brown is remembered for the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, where he and his followers brutally murdered a group of pro-slavery settlers. John Brown moved his anti-slavery operations east. In October of 1859, Brown intended to incite a slave rebellion by attempting to capture the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and supply arms to a rebellious slave army. The idea of millions of armed slaves in rebellion against their masters terrified Southerners and solidified the resistance to Northern interference. By the time of the election of 1860, both the North and the South were determined not to compromise. Southerners saw the Republican Party as representatives of abolitionists, and Northerners saw Democrats too eager to compromise. The Democratic vote was divided between three candidates, and this allowed the Republicans to win the election. Abraham Lincoln was elected as the 16th president. Southerners saw this election as endangering their way of life. Southern states chose to secede rather than to submit to Northern domination and pressure. On the morning of April 12, 1861, just 39 days after Lincoln took office, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Confederates were determined to prevent the Union from resupplying the garrison at the fort. Without fresh supplies, the fort surrendered the next day. The war went on to last 4 more years, with over 625,000 Americans killed on both sides, and hundreds of thousands more wounded and maimed.
Let's go. Okay. I was going to talk a little bit about the events that led up to the Civil War. Basically, before the War of 1812, there was no sense of national identity. People just thought of themselves as a resident of the state they lived in. But after that time, a sense of regionalism started to develop. And by 1820, people had a definite sense of a southern identity and a northern identity. And conflicts started to arise between the two groups over political influence. You see that already starting in like 1820 with the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, where in order to keep peace, they have to have a free state enter whenever a slave state enters the Union. But if you look here, by 1860, the population of the North is way more than the South. There's about 2/3 of the House of Representatives are from northern states, 1/3 are from southern states. The House of Representatives is based on population. But the South was still very, very important economically. From 1800, cotton production was about 7% of all American exports. But by 1860, it accounted for over 58% of all American exports. So the Southern economy was the key to the American economy. So the South was still very important. And again, looking back at the Compromise of 1820, when a free state entered, a slave state had to enter the Union at the same time. So you can see they're pretty much basically equally represented. And in the Senate, each state gets two Senate votes. So they're about equally represented in the Senate. And the Southern senators helped to lost my spot again. The Senate used the South used the Senate to influence politics in the United States and push their agenda on the rest of America. And as you can see by the population chart here, in 1860, about two-thirds of the American population lived in the North, and only about 1/3 lived in the South. And out of the 1/3 in the South, about 1/3 of those were still slaves in bondage. So about less than 1/3 of the American population is telling the other 2/3 what to do. So there's a lot of resentment in the North against the South for pushing their agenda on people. And books came out like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it described the evils of slavery. And it was in protest of the Compromise of 1850, which basically forced Northerners to enforce slavery by sending runaway slaves back to the South. Okay? And Harriet Beecher Stowe, again, wrote this book as a protest against that law and brought out the evils of slavery. And it was a very popular book in America, and everybody read about the evils of slavery. So Northern people began to doubt that there was a real need for slavery. And Southern people looked at the book and said, these people need to mind their own business. And this is a picture of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Abraham Lincoln referred to her one time jokingly as the woman that started the Civil War.